So today we're going to be talking about the flood claim and what you really need to know and ask. And we're not going to necessarily call out questions you should be asking, but more of an awareness of what you should know as you're going through a flood claims process. And that really sets up the stage for the rest of the subject, because in that claim, or during or after a flood, you're going to have things that happen such as an increased cost of compliance, steps and points of frustration, and what is ICC as it's known if you've never heard of that before, and how can you get ICC funds. Substantially damaged, what the community's role is. So I'm going to speak from my experience. It's done a little bit differently all across the country, but that's okay, because knowing those differences is important to understand why something might be happening in your community versus somebody else's community as you're talking to them. Federal mitigation assistance grants and other grant opportunities. The unique thing that happened to us up here in New England is we had all this flooding and disaster and never got a federally declared disaster. So we had a lot of people that were looking for assistance and funding opportunities that didn't have that federal assistance available. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then building in a flood zone and ensuring compliance. After a flood and everything happens and you're looking at your damaged home and you want to build it right back to the way it was, and that's not always possible or a good idea. And we're going to talk a little bit about that to make sure that you're doing the right things to put yourself back in a better position than when you started. Oh, okay. So for those of you that either have gone through a flood or maybe you're concerned that you could end up going through a flood, and that should be everyone across the entire country, this is the very boiled down claims process. Your damage occurs, you file a claim with your agent. The adjuster does something called scoping the loss, meaning they show up to your property and they come there and they start to write down things, take pictures, measure your building. Then an advance claim may be filed. Depending on the size of the claim, the adjuster should actually be offering you up to 30% around there of your claim in advance of the rest of the claim. And by advance, it's not right on the spot. It's about a week or so to get that advance payment to you. And then the rest of the claim happens after the adjustment of the rest of the claim. The adjuster sends an estimate and proof of loss. So they'll send you an estimate of what they believe your claim is valued at. And within 60 days of that day of loss, you should have your proof of loss signed and returned. If you don't, it's not like the claim is denied, but there are waivers and there's a lot more paperwork you have to go through in order to get that claim settled. One of the things I did want to mention that's not in this presentation is you can file what's called a supplemental if you find damage after your initial claim. So don't think that the claim is the end of the road. You do want to adjust that claim as best as you can, but you do want to understand that you start tearing floors up and you find beams that you couldn't see before that were damaged. That can all be filed in a supplemental at any time after the claim. In fact, in Hurricane Sandy, for those of you that I don't know if we have anyone that went through Hurricane Sandy, supplementals were still being filed years after Hurricane Sandy. So what do you need to keep in mind? Well, what is not covered is just as important as what is covered under your flood insurance policy through the federal government. The flood insurance program gets a bad rap a lot of times, and in some ways it deserves it, in a lot of ways it doesn't. But the National Flood Insurance Program actually has a lot of coverages that you won't find in some private flood insurance programs. So we're going to talk specifically about the federal flood insurance program and why, what you may not have that's covered. You also want to keep in mind, are you properly insured? There was a lot of media reports recently about people that were saying they were so underpaid and they didn't get their claims paid the way they thought they were going to. And while that might be the case, and I'm not saying that their complaints weren't justified, there's a lot that goes into adjusting a claim. And one of the biggest things is, did you have the proper amount of insurance to avoid having a penalty levied against you to not get what you should? And to be properly insured on a single family dwelling, if it's your primary residence, you still also need to have at least 80% of the replacement cost of your structure insured to avoid getting a depreciated claim payout. And so I just talked about a lot of words, and we can talk about what that actually looks like later if anyone has a question about that. When cleanup is involved, what will and won't be paid? So we're not going to go into the details of cleanup, but I have uploaded to our website, which you'll have at the end of this presentation, a Fema Bulletin. There's a lot of angst over what is or isn't covered when there's cleanup involved, right? Carpet cleanings, wall cutting, that type of thing. Fans being brought in to air out a certain area. Those are all things that are covered, but only if they're done right for the full amount of the cleanup. And so you're going to want to understand before you even get a service company in there to your property, what will and won't be covered. So that bulletin is on our website, and you'll see the website at the end of the presentation. Is it worth filing a claim? Well, we're going to talk in just a second about why we're even saying that, right? No agent, no advocate would ever say don't file a claim, and we're not saying that. We just want to make sure you understand the implications if you do. Can I file for more money once I file a claim? So we just talked about that. Yes, you can. How long do I have to file my claim? Well, we talked about the 60 days, right? There's the 60-day proof of loss that has to be signed within that time. Most adjusters, again, can do it in that time. Really where the 60 days becomes a problem is if you just decide to file your claim 50 days into the loss. Now, not a lot of people do that. We had some situations up here in New England where people were away all winter, didn't even know their house got flooded, came home after the 60-day time frame. And what if I'm not happy with my claim amount? Well, there's an appeal that can be filed, and a lawsuit must be filed within 1 year of your claim being denied. So we'll talk a little bit about, here at the Coalition, we're actually partnering with some other major nonprofits to set up a claims handling program where we'll start to help people through this process. So please feel free through the process. If you're not happy with your claim, we'll certainly talk through that. So you never have coverage from the following, right? And so we're going to, again, make this presentation available. So I'm not going to go through everything, but highlighted items are damage caused by moisture, mildew, or mold that could have been avoided by the property owner, right? So you have a flood, there's no mold or mildew damage, but you didn't properly prevent the growth of mold or mildew, right? Think about those hot summers, you just had a flood. Now, if mold and mildew grows, that could have been prevented. You don't have any coverage. So that is a really critical piece to make sure that you do everything you can to prevent the growth of mold or mildew, because that coverage is excluded. Seawalls, hot tubs, living expenses such as temporary housing is not covered under the federal policy. Financial losses, obviously cars and vehicles that are not part of the servicing of the building. But here's the highlight here, which is cleanup and debris removal is covered under the flood policy. Now, I'm a big advocate and will always tell you that the best tool to recovery is having a flood insurance policy, because think about it this way. You have a $100,000 home and the entire home gets wiped away. Well, you had the proper amount of insurance. You had $100,000 in flood insurance. But if you use the debris removal part of the policy, the $100,000 for the coverage of your building is also what's used to remove debris. So if you have a $100,000 home and to remove the debris of that home costs you $20,000, you only have $80,000 left to rebuild your home. So it's critical. That's why having a little bit more flood insurance than the building is worth is actually good. Because if your home is destroyed, you can utilize that for cleanup and debris removal. So knowing your building's loss history is just as critical, because you'll see on the right side of the screen, and I'll read it for those that are listening in, if you have an older building, and when we talk about older buildings within the flood program, we're talking about buildings that were built before flood maps existed for your community. I know around the country it's different where the flood maps might not be as old, but in New England, we have communities that got in the program in the 73, 75, 77. So we're talking our older housing stock up here anyways in New England that would be considered these quote unquote older buildings within the flood program. Well, if you file claims on that building that equal to, and I'll read the definition, 4 or more separate claims that have been made within the amount of each claim exceeding $5,000 each, or 2 separate claim payouts that have been made with both of those claims exceeding the fair market value of the building, you become what's known as a severe repetitive loss. Now, we hear about these structures all the time on the news because they get all the media highlights for causing the program to have so much debt. Well, that is and isn't true. It's a whole nother story. The bottom line for you, though, as a flood survivor or a flood stakeholder, is that if this goes back to the beginning of the building's history, back to 1978 is when FEMA started tracking loss history. So these claim amounts, 4 claims, separate claims of $5,000 or more, 2 of which have to be made in a 10-year period of each other, that goes all the way back to 1978. That's when that tracking starts. So do you know your building's loss history? Well, you might know the loss history as long as you've owned it, but do you know the building's loss history before you owned it? And that is critical, because if you are in a 1 to 4 family building and you file claims that cause you to become a severe repetitive loss, you will start to see your premium increase at 25% a year. 25% a year. So what we want to make sure that you understand here is that the bottom line here is know your building's loss history. The best way to do that, go to your current flood agent and ask them for the loss history of the building. Only you and your insurance agent can get a copy of that loss history. So if you're looking to buy a building and you may have a concern about the loss history of the building, you can ask them. I think we have a few questions here. So the question is substantial damage. This is tracked from 1978. So this is separate from substantial damage, and we're actually going to be talking about substantial damage next. What we're talking is just simply the loss history of a building. So for example, if you have a $20,000 claim, that's not going to be substantially damaged, but it is going to be considered it's going to be one of those claims of $5,000 or more that is tracked back to 1978. So the real point here is that the loss history, and it may or may not correlate to substantial damage. So if you have a $100,000 home and you have $60,000 worth of damage, well, yeah, that counts towards your loss history, but it also causes you to be substantially damaged. Now, if you are substantially damaged, and we're going to talk about what that means in just a second here, if you're substantially damaged, the community should be asking you to elevate or mitigate that home, and then the loss history basically starts over from 1. So we had a question on define pre-firm. So thank you. I'm glad that we had the question, because when we talk older buildings, we really mean pre-firm buildings. So I'm looking at the slide now, and I put pre-firm in there, so I apologize for that. Pre-firm means pre-flood insurance rate map. So those are the buildings built before the community ever had flood maps introduced, and that date is different depending on what county or city or town that you live in. Like, for example, in my town, it's October 14th of 1977. In the town next to me, it's October 19th of 1977. What's important here, there is a community master file, and actually that's actually a good thing that we'll put the master file up on our website so that you guys can access it. And actually, it's a pretty archaic looking file because FEMA produces it. You can scroll down and find your community's date of pre-firm, basically when the maps were introduced for the first time. And we have a question, loss history is a history of claims paid out. Yes, that is correct. Loss history is the claims under the federal flood insurance policy that are paid out. So if there was a flood policy on the building, for example, and there isn't now, but they had losses under that policy, there's still a claims history that you'll need to ask the insurance agent, your insurance agent, you as the owner of the property, to get that claims history. So We just wanted to make sure that you understood that you really should know the claims history of your building, because if you've had, you know, a handful of $5,000 losses, could the next one cause you to see those 25% annual increases? We would never discourage you from putting a claim in, but we also want to make sure you are aware before you suddenly see that jump. We had another question. So it is categorized by the address of the building because it follows the buildings from 1978 to today. So you'll need to ask about the current address of the building. And addressing within the flood insurance program can get a little messy, especially historic addressing, especially if things have changed, communities have been annexed or added. So you're going to want to make sure that you ask all those questions about making sure that addressing is correct as well, historic addressing. So is there anything happening to get real estate flood disclosures more honest? Well, that's a great question. So the question is there anything happening to get real estate flood disclosures more honest? For example, disclosing the fact that there is a loss history. Because remember, if you're buying a home and somebody doesn't disclose to you that loss history, you as the potential buyer can't request that loss history unless you become the owner of the property. This is a big issue, and it's been an issue for a while because of all the privacy acts and privacy laws in place. Right now, there is no, at least in here in Massachusetts, there's no mandatory disclosure for flood loss history. There may be in other areas. So that's going to be something that's usually done by state, but the federal privacy laws are pretty clear that you cannot disclose a flood loss, or you can't ask for that flood loss history and receive it unless you're the current owner. But I know that's different from an actual disclosure. So there was another question: if you didn't have flood insurance but FEMA paid money, is this included in the loss history? That's actually a really great question. So we're talking about like disaster assistance, the money, personal assistance, disaster assistance. So it is and it isn't included in the loss history. So while it may not cause you to become a severe repetitive loss, it will preclude you from being rated potentially by being grandfathered within the federal program. So that should show up on a loss history as well. Any type of federal aid or assistance, disaster assistance. We had another question: does the history restart every 10 years from the first payout? So yes. So for example, if today you got a $5,000 payout and in 10 years you didn't get another one, then the clock is now starting over. But if you got a $5,000 payout today and then got another one in 2 years, you've already met the 10-year loss history period. Now the only thing missing to make you a severe repetitive loss is at any time in the life of the building, 2 more losses of $5,000 or more. What really gets people, and that's a great question, is that 5,000 or more in the 10 years, because if it happens within the 10 years, the other 2 can happen at any time in the building's life. The other question is, do any of these situations apply where you do not have flood insurance? So we'll have to take that one independently. So these situations, there's very specific situations in different areas, and we can talk about those afterwards very specifically about flood insurance and flooding history and flooding issues. There's also another question. This is interesting, like double whammy. Well, it is and it isn't. Remember, this only applies to buildings that are older. So if you have a newer structure, and why we say older, pre-firm buildings, newer buildings do have a loss history that follows with it. And they can become severe repetitive losses. They just don't have the 25% annual increase issue once they become a severe repetitive loss. So really, again, this may seem cumbersome and it can be a little confusing to understand the time history and all the different pieces. The bottom line here is make sure you know your building's history by asking for that loss history from your agent. So we can take more questions on that, but I'm going to keep moving to the next slide. Okay, so what is ICC? I might be a little repetitive here for people that have already been through this process or may have not been through it and not know. At least we're creating an awareness here, though. ICC is called increased cost of compliance or construction, increased cost of compliance or increased cost of construction, and is built into almost every single flood insurance policy that is written. And I say almost because there's some exclusions that it's not on unit owners for condos. ICC is a $30,000 grant almost that's built into almost every single flood policy. So ICC can only be used to elevate, demolish, move, or in commercial buildings, flood-proof the building. And the $30,000 cannot exceed the $250,000 max for residential or $500,000 max for commercial or other residential structures. So, for example, you have a $250,000 loss, you're not going to get any ICC. But if you have a $150,000 loss, you'd be eligible for ICC. Now, ICC can only be used if you are substantially damaged. We had a question earlier about what substantially damaged. Now, this is where substantially damaged comes into play. So ICC can only be used for flood damage as well. Now, when we do presentations on this more locally, we talk about your homeowner's policy because you may want to ask, if the house burns down, you still have to build it to the flood requirements, but you don't get ICC, but that's a homeowner's policy. They have a line on there called ordinance and law coverage that you'll want to double check to make sure you have enough if you're in a flood zone. So the steps to receive increased cost of compliance: your regular claim will close, and at that point your adjuster should at least give you an indication on whether you are eligible for ICC or not. Then the adjuster doesn't decide, but the adjuster helps the community make the substantial damage designation. And we're going to talk in the next slide about how that's done and what you need to be asking. Then a claim is filed and a second proof of loss is filed. So this is now a separate claim for ICC once you get that substantial damage letter. And then I circled the last two because this is where the pain points are. Work begins with payments and work to be completed within 6 years. So work will begin and payments are given in thirds, I believe. They've changed it over the years. I believe now it's thirds. So first third of the project is done, ICC is released. Next third is done, ICC is released, and so on. So these are some pain points, but it takes a long time. You know, this is not, as you know, if you're recovering from a flood or a flood victim, this is a process that requires patience but perseverance. So it's really going to be something where it's worth it at the end, but it's going to take some time to try to move through. So now we're going to talk about substantial damage, and this is really where there's a lot of words here, but I'm going to boil this down pretty simply. Substantial damage is the same as substantial improvement. Substantial damage happens, and then, of course, once substantial damage happens, you have to substantially improve. Substantial damage is when the market value of the building exceeds 50% of its pre-damaged value in damage. A $100,000 building receives $51,000 in damage. You are now substantially damaged. But I think the important thing to talk about here is when we talk about market value, right? There's a lot of talk about what that word means. And the NFIP defines it as whatever the appraisal comes back as through an appraiser. But communities, according to the Substantial Damage Manual, are allowed to also do substantial damage based on appraised value with some type of multiplier to adjust for the difference in what's appraised versus what's assessed value from what's assessed versus what's appraised. So for example, assessed value, at least in New England here, assessed values are usually much lower than appraised values, right? The town goes out to do the assessed value, but the independent appraiser is going to come back with a much higher number. So that difference might be lower in other parts of the country, but if a community is designating you substantially damaged based on an assessed number versus an appraised number, the difference is going to could possibly mean whether you're required to elevate your home or not. Now, I'm not discouraging people try to get around substantial damage or substantial improvement. We just want to make sure that you're asking the right questions to make sure that the community is doing things appropriately to get you to the right resolution to your flood claim. Because remember, without substantial damage and the letter that the community issues, you don't get ICC funding. So the two are very related and very important. So I do have a question here. Okay, so this brings up a great question. The question is, can we go back to the assessed versus the other? So at the end of the day, the answer is yes and no, and I'll tell you why. And this is why I wanted to spend some time on this. Actually, that was the next piece I was going to mention, which is the community is going to decide to do their substantial damage on some metric. It's either going to be the market value by an appraisal, the assessed value that the community has with some type of multiplier. I can tell you our community uses no multiplier, which is a whole nother issue. There's also a program called the Substantial Damage Software Program, and there's a big uproar right now in Houston about this program not being used correctly. That's another program. No matter what is used by the community, you have the right to challenge the community's designation 90% of the time by an appraisal, a separate independent appraisal of your choice, by you paying to have it done. So for example, if the community uses assessed value and you want your ICC funds and the assessed value is way lower, then you're going to want to come in with an appraisal to get the value of the home higher. In order to, I'm sorry, if you don't want to elevate the home, a lot of people will use that. But if you wanted to, if they're using an appraiser and you want to have an independent appraisal done to show that the building's value is less so that you get your ICC funds, there's a way to do that. Now, I'm not advocating to try to play the system. What I'm advocating for is that you know that if they're using, you're going to want to ask them how they're making those substantial damage designations. Are they doing assessed value? Are they doing market value? Are they using the substantial damage estimating tool by FEMA? And in major disasters like Houston, they're also allowed to go out and do a very quick scope. And they drive around and they say that building's probably substantially damaged and that one is too. And that's actually okay at the time because there's so much damage. But when they get back to really handing out those substantial damage letters, you're going to want to find out how they did it. Who in the community decides the level of damage? That's a great question. So usually what happens in a case of a substantial damage is the community, I mentioned earlier that the adjuster hands in a damage assessment. A damage assessment's done for ICC, right? So the adjuster shows up and your home is fairly well destroyed by a flood. They're going to fill out what's called a damage assessment, and they're going to give that to the community. That does not make the substantial damage designation, but it allows the community to get an indication that there could be a substantial damage at that location. Then what the community does is they have your contractor must file a detailed estimate of what needs to be repaired. Because remember, substantial damage is the same as substantial improvement because now you're improving. So now that detailed estimate is going to show the cost of the repairs, and then that's where that appraisal or assessment is used to gauge whether those repairs versus the actual assessment or appraisal are more than 50% of the original value of the building. So that's where so it's the building official, it is the building department 90% of the time that's making the market value versus assessed value determination. So we have so we have a mention here that it was a rapid response team or something like that that used the program from FEMA. And so that is also, so that's exactly what I was talking about. They have rapid response teams that come in, they use the damage assessment program, which again can be challenged by an independent appraisal, but you'd have to pay for that to be done. What we're learning here is that most appeals work. If you want to appeal your substantial damage designation, most of the time it works. to appeal the community's designation. Okay, so here's actually a step-by-step look at what's done. So only a community official can issue SISD designations, and that's what we were talking about with the community official. This can drastically change your standing in the National Flood Insurance program, because if you become substantially damaged or substantially improved, again, similar things or same thing, you're now considered post-firm. You're no longer pre-firm. So this now changes your designation within the program from an older building to a newer building. While the definition uses market value, we just talked about that. This can be challenged by getting an independent appraiser, and the adjuster's estimate is only an indicator. So you can see on the right side, damage is done. The adjuster sends a claim estimate to the community. Permit is applied by the resident. Community requests detailed estimate of work, and the SISD determination is made. So we're almost at the end here. So we have about 3 or 4 more slides. So we're going to go through these. Again, these are grant opportunities. We wanted to spend some time making sure you understood these opportunities exist. You know, I love Flood Forum because I got my start in this about 10 years ago as an advocate for citizens, for actually coastal infrastructure at the time. And when it comes to these 2 grant opportunities, advocacy is absolutely key, because communities don't want to move forward with these grant opportunities unless there is a good amount of people in the community that want to apply, and B, pressure is put on them to submit applications. So we're going to start with FMA. That's the Federal Mitigation Assistance Program. So in both instances, whether it's FMA and the other one is Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP, the community must apply for both. So you as a resident are a sub-applicant to the community. So if the community says, you know, we're not going to apply this year for HMGP or FMA, you are out of luck. So that's why, as a little background, that's why FEMA at one point was talking about having a severe repetitive loss grant program. While the merits may not have been right, allowing people to rebuild once grants were handed out, the idea was that they wanted to try to figure out a way when communities say no, you can still say yes. And so that's not the case here, though. So with FMA, the community must apply, and Congress appropriates money each year for these programs. And, oh, hold on. We have one question here. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So FMA community, we do not have to be presidential. That's right. So here's the difference. So HMGP is a presidential declaration. We'll talk about that. FMA is not a presidentially declared disaster. Basically, Congress has recently appropriated $175 million for nationally for everyone to apply to the program. So now it's a nationally competitive program. So just because your community applies doesn't mean you'll get the grant, but at least they've applied. Our area has received 2 of these grants over the last 3 years. So we have a very good program to get these grants. It requires some work requires some upfront costs. So you're going to be required to get things like engineering plans done, cost estimates from your contractor on what you want to do, whether it be elevating or mitigating your structure. And the work, once it is done, is paid in installments. So it's a reimbursement program. So there are some obstacles for FMA, but at the end of the day, they pay up to 100% reimbursement for severe repetitive loss structures. So if you're a severe repetitive loss structure, and 90% for repetitive loss structures, which is basically 2 losses in a 10-year period of $1,000 or more, it's a little different for the grant program, but I know we didn't talk about repetitive loss. So it's really beneficial once you go through it, but you have to advocate for your community to try to apply for FMA. Now, HMGP, unfortunately, is only a presidentially declared disaster. Now, the community still must apply, and you're eligible for up to 75% of the work that's going to be done to be reimbursed to you. And it's available for more than individual mitigation. Communities actually use this money a lot to do like drainage and stream projects and road repairs and stuff like that after a big disaster. So remember, the key here is patience, but perseverance. And this is where the perseverance really comes in, because you've got to advocate and press your community to move forward. So we're now going to really, to wrap this all up, we're going to talk about what this all boils down to, which is ensuring compliance. You know, one of the big things we get concerned about locally is making sure that communities are doing the right thing, because residents and stakeholders and flood victims like yourself, you're only a resident stakeholder, you're not a professional in the field. You shouldn't be required to know code. You shouldn't be required to know your flood policy inside and out, but unfortunately you do, in a lot of cases, have to at least know on the surface what to be looking for. We talked a lot today about the community's role in doing different things, substantial damage, and making sure, and grants and things like that. The real thing here to know, though, is that communities don't always do the right thing, and I think we all know that. We had some communities up here that called me, and I get at least one call a year where the community says, hey, is this how we're supposed to be building? Because this is what our building department's telling us. It's not even close to the way it's supposed to be done. So why is compliance critical? After a flood, it can be easy to want to rebuild the way things were, right? Put your basement back, put your building right back on its slab, do all these things that with the way the building used to be. But this can be a critical mistake, and the community should not allow this, but some do, okay? Because you need to ask the community, you need to ask if the community is not requiring a pre-construction elevation certificate. So we're talking about buildings that need to be rebuilt or are substantially damaged. So these are buildings that require being built almost from the ground up or having substantial damage, substantial improvement work being done. So when you're substantially damaged, let's go through the steps, and we have a very quick reference on the right, again, high level. Permits are filed, the community should be checking or notifying you of compliance, right? So when you file your permit, the community, if it wasn't caught already, should be saying, well, the plans either show you in the flood zone or out of the high-risk flood zone, in the floodway, out of the floodway. These are things that the community should be telling you or talking to you about. Then the community will require a pre-construction elevation certificate. So this is an elevation certificate that shows what the building will look like when it's done. 3 inspections are done during construction, or there should be at least 3, and post-construction elevation certificate is also required. So you need to be asking if the community is not requiring a pre-construction elevation certificate, why they're not requiring that. Because you have your best intentions, your builder has your best intentions usually, and the community does too, but if there's no data to back what you're trying to do, everyone could be in the dark. Non-compliance can cause very high insurance premiums. For example, if you build at the flood elevation, then you're going to have a premium of about, we'll say $1,500. If you drop a foot below the flood elevation, that could go up to as high as $2,500 to $3,000. So that 1 foot below could be critical. Non-compliant buildings lose CRS discounts. If your community is a CRS community, then you could potentially lose discounts. And non-compliant buildings cannot be grandfathered. We have a question. Is the elevation certificate, does it apply to certain year that the house will be built, or does the elevation certificate to all house being elevated? So the elevation certificate for new construction should be done once you have a plan from your engineer on how the building is going to be built. So if you're planning to break ground in 3 months, that elevation certificate should refer to the building when it breaks ground. So that hopefully will answer that question. So here are just some quick diagrams. Now, what you're going to want to do is understand, and we got some fly-ins here. I didn't take the fly-ins out, so we'll let them come in. There are several different requirements depending on the state that you live in, but we're going to talk about the base code, meaning the NFIP minimum standards, because state building code actually supersedes. For example, if your state has the ICC building code, and that's not ICC increased cost of construction, has the ICC building code, then you actually have to go a foot above the NFIP minimum standards. So we're only going to talk about NFIP minimum standards because each state is different. So NFIP standards your lowest floor has to be at or above the base flood elevation. Your equipment has to be at or above the base flood elevation. And you are allowed to have enclosures as long as they are properly vented. In a V zone, that's in an A zone. In a V zone, same rules apply, only the building has to be elevated on piers, posts, and piles, meaning elevated up. And the lowest floor is not rated from the floor you stand on, but from the top of the pilings. So you think you might be going that extra foot if you want a lower premium, and really when the floor is that extra foot, but the bottom of the floor or the top of the piling is actually below the base flood elevation. This is why those pre-construction elevation certificates are so critical. Lot of information. I know we probably have, whether they be questions now or in the future, we probably have some. I'm more than willing to stay here for as long as we get questions in or as long as we can. And I appreciate everybody. Please check out our website. Here's my email address, jrossi@noflood.org. Noflood.org is our website. Over the next couple months, we're actually releasing some very helpful tools, such as a flood zone identifier. You can order elevation certificates off of our website in the future, and a lot of other great services, including our future claims assistance service. So stay in touch with us. This presentation will be put up on our website, and I will take questions.
I just wanted to interrupt and say that was absolutely spectacular, Joe. Thank you so much. I don't know how you managed to get so much information covered and deal with all the questions. Really, really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Any questions? So I had one question. Can you use your increased cost of compliance, 30,000, and match that with an FMA grant? I gather that the FMA grants will only pay up to 75% if you're not a severe repetitive loss.
Sure. Yes, that's a great question, and the answer is yes. The answer is yes. They allow your cost share to be the 30,000.
Right.
Looks like we have a couple questions popping up, so let me go through them here. Thank you so much. It was a lot of information, but so good. Fantastic. Okay, President. Okay, good. Looks like we're just getting a lot of thank yous. And a couple
we have a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Wait. 1 second.
We had approximately $65,000 loss with Matthew, and another around the same amount with Irma. After Irma, they told us that we couldn't rebuild because we were less than 50%, over 50%. We were like 53% of the assessed value.
Okay.
But they said, I have the ability to go and get, as you discussed, an appraisal done. We got the appraisal done, and it was significantly more. And so we were allowed to go ahead and get the rebuild done.
Sure.
So we've rebuilt twice in an area that's probably going to flood again, which is not very smart. But anyway, what I'm wondering is, are we not a significant, a severe repetitive loss because we now have that new appraisal that shows the value of our house is more?
So that's a great question. If the date of construction of your building has not changed, which the only way it could have is if you actually did get the substantial damage designation. So you were not substantially damaged because you challenged it. So you've received the two losses of $60,000, which I would assume if you combine the two together, is it equal to or more than the replacement cost of the structure?
Right now,
Yes.
I'd say it's less than the replacement. It's less than the replacement cost of the structure.
Okay. So in that definition, it's either 2 claims that equal the fair market value of the structure or 4 claims of $5,000 or more. So technically, if those are your only 2 claims, while you may have met the two in the 10-year period, you still have 2 claims of $5,000 or more at any time in the building's history that you would have to exceed to become a severe repetitive loss. Now, here's a hint. If you want to know whether you're a severe repetitive loss or not, your flood insurance policy's policy number will start with the letters RL. So if your flood policy starts with RL and then the number, you are a severe repetitive loss.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So we had another question. Can you challenge a percent damage from 10 years ago? No, you can't, because it's at the time of the loss and before you start rebuilding. So once the substantial damage designation is made, it has been made. So unfortunately, that is not the case. Yeah, so we had a great question here. Is there a difference between the federal flood insurance and the policy I as a homeowner purchase? Well, so if you're talking about homeowners insurance, then it is different than a federal flood insurance policy. Most flood insurance policies are from FEMA. They may not say federal flood insurance on it, but it is most likely a federal flood policy. It's through the National Flood Insurance Program. So the homeowner's insurance policy will almost never cover a flood. So we have kind of a longer question here that I will definitely help with. Probably, let me get to this other one though real quickly. Remind me, there's a 6-month period. What was that to follow? Okay, so there's a 60-day time frame that you had to file your claim in once the date of the claim happens. So it's a 60-day period that you have to have your proof of loss signed and in. Now, for those that have filed the claim and got it started, they have the 60 days can be waived. If the adjuster is working, you're still negotiating with the adjuster. All those are, it's not like a tight time frame, but if you decide not to file a loss and you get the process started too late, that's when the 60 days really become a big issue, because it's less likely a waiver will be issued for you for just apparent negligence and trying to get that claim filed. So a lot of questions on here about being able to post my information, talk about, any of the comments I made, this presentation. Yes, this is all, this is all through the Coast Coalition, the Massachusetts Coast Coalition, or MCC. So this is all very public information. Please share it. Please share my contact info if anyone has questions, because as a flood expert, not only do I have an expertise, I know a lot of people in the industry, in and out of the industry, that has expertise if I can't specifically find it for you to get something answered. And we have one question here talking about a little bit more of a detailed case. Please, let's take that, and I will definitely be able to make some suggestions offline if you take down my info and shoot me an email. Any detailed cases, I'm more than happy to look at some detailed cases. If you jot down my information in front of you on the screen, shoot me an email with the question, more than happy to get more detailed offline.
Joe, I have another question. Could you explain, so we've discovered 2 communities where homeowners have begged for grants, not known about the availability of the FMA, and then and been told that there aren't any grants. So they've later found out through me, because I'm only just learning about it, about the availability of these grants. From your experience, why are cities not taking up this opportunity? You'd have thought that they would be so keen to help residents.
Yeah, it's actually not because of the grant application, it's because of the grant implementation. So once the communities are awarded the grant, we're dealing here in the town of Marshfield in Massachusetts. We got a 2015 round of FMA, and we are still trying to implement those grants. And so a 3 or 4 year turnaround time on a federal grant takes a lot of resources away from a community. And right, I mean, they have a right to be hesitant because of that type of lag, but it's also a great grant. I mean, it should be something that's applied for, move forward with regardless. But it's the implementation that really gets a lot of that, and to be honest, that, and the fact that the number of applicants, usually after they find out they have to pay for stuff up front, they have to, go through the cost estimate process with the contractors and all that. They go from 100 people that are interested to 5. And so that really becomes another obstacle for a lot of these communities.
Thank you.
I had a question on whether there's a deadline to apply for a grant. That's a great question. So FMA, when HMGP, there's a whole other set of time frames depending on when the presidentially declared disaster is. And so we'll talk only to FMA. FMA is a 2-month window from the day FEMA opens the grant to when they close it. Now, 2 months is not going to be enough time to get all your engineering documents done, all your contractor estimates in. So what I always suggest is if you're considering elevating your home anyways, go ahead and start doing that work. So when FMA opens and your community says they're going to apply, you have all of the information to just give them rather than waiting for that small window of time. It's really not a lot of time at all.
We should make this the last question. I'm just conscious of your time.
Okay, great. There's one more there that says, is there any group working nationally to make real estate agents be forthcoming when selling a house that is subject to any kind of flooding regularly? I would say yes, in that there are all industries are interested in this area. And in fact, FEMA themselves are. Some of the reforms that were proposed for this year's round of reforms, whether they get incorporated or not, actually asked FEMA to give the risk information and loss information publicly and remove the person's name. So you'd be able to go online to a public database, find that property's loss history without a name record of who filed the claims, and to make it available to everyone. I mean, it's much like running a loss history for a homeowner's policy, which is typically done to know whether a building has had a fire loss or any other type of loss. It just so happens when you have the federal government involved, it becomes a little bit more complicated. So these, I would say as an industry, everyone is trying to work towards finding, and especially the private flood industry, because if they're going to write a home and you don't disclose the loss history to the private flood insurance company, they don't have access to your loss history. So they also want access to a public database of loss history. So I think what we'll see is over the next 3 to 5 years, this won't be a major issue anymore. But right now, it certainly still remains, especially with the high annual increases for those older buildings that become severe repetitive losses.
Joe, let me just clarify that question for you a little bit. I'm from Ocean City, New Jersey.
Sure.
Little but very expensive barrier island off the coast of southern New Jersey,
Sure.
below Atlantic City. The question I was kind of asking was from my experience here, the entire west half of the island pretty much floods, even without rain. We get tidal flooding. Our experience is that many realtors will tell people up front, but most realtors do not. We've actually had realtors ask us to remove our Fix Our Flooding Now signs because they were trying to sell homes and they didn't want people to know it flooded.
Sure.
Now, homes don't always incur damage, but like my house doesn't always incur damage, but when Hurricane Jonas came along, I and many others could not exit our homes for 4 days. And I'm finding as I run my group, many people are being told they asked their realtors before they purchased if this home was in a flooding area, not necessarily damaged, but did the streets flood? And they were told no, when in fact, that's a big fat lie.
Sure.
So what I'm wondering, we have a lot of honest realtors here, but we have some that are not. And it's my understanding that there is no standard for real estate agents to disclose this information even when asked.
Yeah, no, that's actually, so you're talking more almost broadly where there's like areas that flood.
Right.
And I think that's actually, so we did an interesting thing back in 2013 when we had new flood maps where we actually put the proposed flood elevation around telephone poles with blue ribbon. And that also invoked the same hysteria from the real estate market, which is you're telling these people that this is a potential flooding hazard and we can't sell homes now. So what I would say is granularly more in the regional areas, yes, there are groups that are certainly doing that. What I would tell you is that there's an entire movement out there called risk scoring. I don't know if you've heard of this movement.
Mm.
Risk scoring basically takes an area and defines its risk of flooding by a score. So you have a generalized area, for example, your barrier island there, and in a score from 1 to 10, I would say that's probably a 9 in terms of its frequency of flooding. And we actually at the coalition will start being able to offer risk scoring in about 6 months or so. But the more important thing about risk scoring is that FEMA is changing their rating structure to show risk scoring by 2020. So your disclosure won't necessarily be a disclosure anymore. It's going to be required to get your flood policy.
Mhm.
So this is going to be something that FEMA has already outlined the way that they're going to do it. They know they're going to start rolling this out in late 2020. And it's hopefully going to be something that changes the way we perceive risk. I think it goes almost exactly to your concern.
Sounds like it. Thank you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And thank you so much for everyone who's joined the call. I really appreciate it, and we will have future training, so I look forward to promoting them. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. You can send me questions through my email, so let's keep the conversation going.